Hi, this is your host Swapn Bhartiya and welcome to TFiR Let's Talk. And today we have with us Sefi Genis, CTO and Co-Founder at Firefly. Sefi, it's great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Today we are going to talk about infrastructure as code, best practices, code security, visibility, cost, and a lot of other factors that impact IAC. But before we go there, I would love to know a bit about the company because you're also co-founder. So tell me, what is the company all about and why you created the company?
So Firefly is a cloud asset management solution that brings clouds up to code. We scan the entire cloud footprint and Kubernetes cluster, and we codify everything to IAC, such as Terraform, Pulumi, CloudFormation, etc. Using our technology, we help DevOps teams to detect drifts between the cloud and the IAC, and they can find classification and insights over the cloud for security, cost, and SRE purposes.
Now let's talk about, we talked about the kind of, what is the company all about. Can you also talk about what are the challenges that are there in the cloud native, cloud-centric world when it comes to, identity management?
Sure. So I'm going to talk about best practices. A few weeks ago, we launched our first open source tool called ValidIaC. We pronounce it as ValidIaC. This tool helps validate best practices for infrastructure as code. And it combines few open source tools such as TFSec, TFLint, InfraCost, and InfraMap, and I'm going to expand about them. So TFLint is a static code analysis tool that validates best practices for code, such as syntax error and etc. TFSec is a static code analysis tool that helps to find security vulnerabilities, misconfiguration for security purposes. InfraCost is an open source tool that helps estimate the pricing for infrastructure as code resources. And InfraMap is an open source tool that generates a graph with a connection between resources.
You mentioned that you're going to talk about some of the best practices. When we do look at best practices, there are two things. Of course, there's technology aspect, and then there is a people aspect. So can you also talk about the cultural people aspect as well there? So it's also about the processes. Of course, technologies are there in place.
Sure. So the reason that we built this open source tool is because Terraform is challenging. I guess that you heard about the shift left approach. That means that instead of creating resources in the cloud, we use IAC to deploy them. And before the shift left approach, the only way to detect security issues or cost problems was only by using third-party tools such as a CSPM or CloudHealth. But now you have open source tools that can help you detect everything before actually deploy them. And one more thing is that Terraform is challenging. I'm a developer. I have experience in Go, in Python, in Node.js, and it was challenging for me to study Terraform. It's the difference between declarative and imperative language.
Now let's talk about the open source aspect of it. You folks do a lot of open source. Why?
I decided to build a ValidIaC because I struggled with those open source tools by myself. I put them in my CI/CD pipeline. As a CTO, it's important for me to comply with best practices, and I need to deep dive into them, into the configuration, etc. By the way, I saw that the Kubernetes community, that they have an open source tool called ValidKube that pretty much doing the same for Kubernetes YAMLs. And I wonder why our community, why the infrastructure as code community, why don't we have a tool like that? And I also saw my customers struggling with best practices. That's lead me to build this infrastructure as code open source.
So the inspiration for ValidIaC came from ValidKube. Are you also leveraging any code from ValidKube as well, or it's a totally different project altogether?
Sure. So it's more than inspiration. We actually fork their GitHub repository, and we use their front end, for example. And we took their code and we just changed it to infrastructure as code open source.
You alluded to that in the beginning, but I am always curious about the actual and direct impact on a project or a product's, on a developer's life. So can you talk about what immediate value ValidIaC brings to a developer's operator's life?
As I mentioned before, in order to use those open source tools, you need to deep dive into them and into their configuration. ValidIaC, it's a browser-based tool that you can copy your Terraform configuration and paste it in validiac.com. And with one click, you can find the results of all of our checkers. And I'll give you some examples for that. The TF can detect EC2 instances with the wrong instance types. For example, if now we are going to deploy Terraform, if you're going to deploy an EC2 with Terraform won't tell you that it's a problem. Just when you apply this resource, you will get any error. And TF helps to detect issues like that, name convention, and etc. One more thing is that TFsec, open source tool that was created by Aqua Security, helps to find security vulnerability, misconfiguration, and etc. For example, if now you have a security group that is open to the entire world, so TFsec will find it. Or if you have an IAM user without MFA configured, or S3 bucket that is exposed to the entire world. Those examples are pretty much are very important for ValidIaC.
One more thing is with open source, we were talking about open source earlier, is that open source helps solve day one problem. You can get the code from GitHub or GitLab, wherever you're putting the code, get it started. But you need feature, you need support. So that's where commercialization of open source also plays a big role. Can you also talk about how is Firefly offering support for ValidIaC to potential customers or users?
So ValidIaC is an open source tool. It's just an open source tool, but Firefly is a cloud asset management solution. And we put the ValidIaC inside our system. For example, if now you use Firefly to codify resources from the cloud to Terraform, you can use internally in Firefly, you can use ValidIaC to make sure that your Terraform configuration set with best practices for security, for cost, etc.
Can you also talk about how easy or difficult it is to use ValidIaC?
So ValidIaC is very easy to use. It's a browser-based tool that you can click. You can copy your Terraform configuration, and with one click, you can get the results of all the checkers. You can also download ValidIaC to your local machine and run the CLI using Docker, or just run it.
What is the importance for developers, or depends on the whole DevOps teams, to not only understand about IaC, but also learn about its tools as well?
Infrastructure as code today is the only way to manage cloud. I'll give you some example. Before Terraform, before Terraform, CloudFormation, etc., you created resources in the cloud using ClickOps, and it was not manageable. I mean, for example, if you want to manage multi-environments such as production, staging, QA, etc., the only way to manage everything is using immutability, and infrastructure as code helps you to create a group of resources and deploy those environments.
You're looking at one problem areas, and that's why you created ValidIaC. What are the other challenges that you're seeing that users who are embracing infrastructure as code are facing in general?
Sure. So difficult problems in infrastructure as code is drifts. For example, you can create resources using Terraform, deploy them to the cloud, but someone changes the configuration behind. It means that it could be a person or it could be an automation. Imagine, for example, that you create a security group in the cloud and someone open it to the entire world. So in Firefly, by the way, we work a lot with drift, we detect them, and we automatically fix them.
Sefi, thank you so much for taking time out today, and of course talk about ValidIaC project, but also explain a bit about the challenges that are there for those who are embracing infrastructure as code, and share your insights to help them. Thanks for those insights, and I would love to have you back on the show. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure to join here today.